Hello and welcome. I'm Delana Sepko.
And I'm Trish Caird.
You're listening to Aye Lassie, which is a 3-part series that introduces you to Scottish women's history. We think that there are generations of extraordinary Scottish women who in their own ways have helped shape the world we live in now.
But we noticed that some of our heroines have been misrepresented or almost forgotten, so we're excited to have the chance to tell you about them and their work. I'm Trish and I'd like to talk to you about two women. Not women born today, or yesterday, or even in Scotland, but they were remarkable for all that, and they lived in a time when women had few rights, little access to the law, had to obey their menfolk, their father, their husband, their brother, and if need be, son. They were largely confined to the private spaces of hearth and home, though married women had more freedom, and widows still more. To speak in public was completely against the rules. The two women I want to talk about don't seem to be the kind of women who would be worthy of attention in a radical women's discussion. But I hope that you will come to understand why I think that they are. Both women grew up with many advantages. They were born into rich, well-connected families, were awarded intensive education in languages, art, poetry, and all the necessities of a woman living in a royal court. And they learned the primary necessity, how to be a political animal. Their world was very different from ours. How they dressed, the music they sometimes heard, the books they read, the words they used, what it is to be a man, and especially what it was to be a woman in the 16th century Renaissance, Scotland and England. The two women I'm talking about, if you've not already guessed it, are Queen Elizabeth I of England and Queen Mary of Scotland. We've all heard of these people, how the Spanish Armada was crushed by a storm sent by God to save Queen Elizabeth England, how Mary, Queen of Scots, murdered her husband of less than a year for personal and political reasons, allegedly. But do we really believe that a storm was sent by God to save a kingdom situated on the edge of Europe? And who really knows who killed Lord Darnley after he survived a house blown to smithereens while he was lying in a sickbed of syphilis or some other equally heinous disease, only to be discovered later in a nearby orchard, unhurt by the explosion, but strangled to death. The world loves a good daring-do yarn, and a whodunit is as popular today as it's ever been. After all, the TV channels are awash with police and espionage tales. But these two tales of high adventure and murder suspect have stood the test of time, for still films are made and books are written. Through the news stories were made up and pinned onto those written before, we're presented with 2-dimensional pictures of 3-dimensional lives. So who were Mary and Elizabeth? Queens, autocratic, proud, rulers of all they surveyed? Or were they more complicated and at the same time simple?
To be king and wear a crown is a thing more glorious to them that see it than it is pleasant to them that bear it.
At 6 days old, on the 15th of December 1542, Mary, daughter of Queen Mary of Guise and King James Stuart V of Scotland, was crowned queen as her father died from wounds suffered by the defeat of the Scottish army by the English at Solway Moss. "It came wi' a lass and it'll gang wi' a lass," is apparently how James received the news that he had fathered a daughter, rather than a desired son and heir. The quote refers to the rise of the House of Stuart on the marriage of Robert the Bruce's daughter Marjorie to Walter the Steward. Marjorie and Mary, separated by 200 years, yet both carried the weight of a nation's expectations on their female shoulders as decided by men. Women as pawns in a play in which they had little control or say. Mary was sent from Scotland to France as a child of 5 to live within the French royal household, where she contracted smallpox, which left her face scarred. There, she also learned the social norms of the French court and was educated in French, Italian, Spanish and Greek. At 16, she secretly bequeathed her kingdom of Scotland and her claim to the English crown to French rule should she die without issue to her fiancé, Francois, the Dauphin of France, and the king's eldest son. However, a year after the marriage, Francois died from an ear infection, and in 1561 Mary, now 18, returned alone to rule in Scotland. Had Francois lived, and it had been Mary who had died, history would have marked a very different path entirely. French claims to both the Scottish and English crowns could have resulted in French rule in the island of Britain. Instead, the widowed Queen Mary returned to Scotland in 1561 with the intent to rule Scotland alone, and with the ambition to secure to herself the English crown should the older Elizabeth die before her. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn and King Henry VIII of England, was born in Greenwich Palace on 7th September 1533. She was a great disappointment to her parents because of her sex, and not the longed-for male heir, an event that meant that her older half-sister Mary remained the heir to Henry's throne. After the execution of her mother, and her father's marriage to his third wife, Elizabeth was proclaimed illegitimate on the birth of her half-brother Edward, but her status as royal remained. However, her father became increasingly unstable, and her place in court was constantly changing. Her escape was a schoolroom, and she was provided with the most progressive educators in Europe, learning, like Mary, numerous languages, writing poetry, and unusually, public speaking. She was probably the most educated woman in England, and perhaps Europe. And after an often traumatic childhood, involving being embroiled in the political machinations of a fractured English court, including being imprisoned by the new Queen Mary on suspicion of plotting against her. The claims, though, were never proven.
I do not rejoice so much that God hath made me to be a queen, as to be a queen over so thankful a people.
In 1559, at age 25, Elizabeth Tudor became the first Protestant Queen of England, and after the death of her Catholic half-sister Mary. As Queen, Elizabeth personified the inequities of being ruler twice over for many of her nobles and common folk. Great uncertainty was caused because England had already switched religious allegiances between Roman Catholic and Protestant rule. The previous reversal had only occurred a few years before, when Elizabeth's half-sister Mary had ascended to the throne. Such further upheaval with the coronation of a young and new ruler was risky enough, but friction was further increased because of Elizabeth's very sex, which stood as another sound reason for her never to be crowned at all. Men were challenged by the idea that any woman should have the smallest authority over a man, and such a repugnant moral wrong was made worse by the fact that a queen could or should be an absolute ruler, like any other king.
There is no marvel in a woman learning to speak, but there would be in teaching her to hold her tongue.
As a queen, Elizabeth saw herself as capable as any competent king, but be tempted to marry one would require a remarkable king. She knew at 25, as Mary had not at 16, that to marry was to secede from direct rule, and a demotion to consort would be the price paid for personal desires.
Though I am not imperial, and though Elizabeth may not deserve it, the Queen of England will easily deserve to have an emperor's son to marry.
However, there would be consequences to such a path as never marrying, not least of which was the problem of Mary of Scotland's claim to right should Elizabeth die childless. When Queen Mary returned home in 1561, the political conditions were a perfect storm of opportunity for religious fanatics of all stripes. Consequently, both queens became focal points of the internal strife within both kingdoms. Mary as Catholic Queen in Protestant Scotland, Elizabeth as Protestant Queen in Catholic England. This turmoil existed throughout Europe as the religious wars between the new Protestant religion clashed against the autocracy of the Roman Catholic Church that had ruled unchallenged for 1500 years, and the instability caused by them were to underpin and define both rulers' political decisions for their entire lives, as both women negotiated the oftentimes contradictory and dangerous realities of their highly class-conscious and entirely patriarchal societies.
I fear the prayers of John Knox more than all the assembled armies of Europe.
Ensconced within the religious beliefs of a woman's place in society, men felt diminished by the reality of two women rulers anointed by God. This was an unnatural position. Not only that women should be in charge, but that men should obey them. In 1558, the Scots reformer John Knox, vehemently describing female rule as blasphemy against God, published First Blast of the Trumpet against the Monstrous Regiment of Women.
I am assured that God hath revealed to some in this our age that is more than a monster in nature, that a woman shall reign and have empire above a man. However abominable, odious and detestable is all such usurped authority. To promote a woman to here rule superiority, dominion of empire above any realm, nation of city, is repugnant to nature. It is the subversion of good order, of all equity and justice. The regiment of woman is a thing most odious in the presence of God. She is a traitor essential and rebel against God. They must study to repress her inordinate price and tyranny to the uttermost of their power. By the Holy Ghost is manifestly expressed in these words: I suffer not a woman to usurp authority above the man. So both by God's law and the interpretation of the Holy Ghost, women are utterly forbidden to occupy the place of God in the offices foresaid, which he has assigned to marriage, whom he hath appointed to be his lieutenant on earth. The apostle taketh power from all women to speak in the assembly.
Not only were women in power an abomination, but their very nature defined their unfitness to rule and decide the actions of men. John Knox wrote, Womankind is imprudent and soft or flexible. Imprudent because she cannot consider with wisdom and reasons things which she heareth and seeth, and soft she is because she is easily bowed. Even the clothes women wore were emblematic of moral and physical weakness. Richard Braithwaite wrote, Soft clothes introduce soft minds. Delicacy in the habit begets effeminacy in the heart. Culturally, Elizabeth and Mary were constrained by societal expectations. And while Mary chose to abide closely with such social norms, Elizabeth immediately set out to show herself as more than just a woman.
Though the sex to which I belong is considered weak, you will nevertheless find me a rock that bends to no wind.
Mary spoke more of feelings, and it has been these parts of her rule that have been examined and judged.
To be kind to all, to like many and love a few, to be needed and wanted by those we love, is certainly the nearest we can come to happiness.
Elizabeth retained a regal distance, but courted the common folk.
And therefore I am come amongst you at this time, not as for my recreation or sport, but being resolved, in the midst and heat of the battle, to live or die amongst you all, to lay down, for my God and for my kingdom and for my people, my honour and my blood, even the dust. I know I have but the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart of a king, and of a king of England too.
As Elizabeth continued in her strategy of divide and rule between her lords and her people, and between the factions of her lords as well, she created space in which she could rule. Always in fear of the invasion from Spanish or French kings, her first policy towards Scotland was to oppose the French presence there. Both France and Spain was Catholic, and if they were successful in deposing Elizabeth, the legitimate claimant to the English crown was, as we know, Scotland's Catholic Mary. And Mary already had affiliations with the French court. To have her ascend the throne would once again remove the Protestant threat and aid Catholics' aims to return Europe to the Catholic faith. But Elizabeth was an astute woman who recognised the dangerous political factions that surrounded her. She kept close eyes and ears on the courts of these powerful and ambitious royals. But it's no wonder, with all these political riptides, that neither woman felt entirely safe within their own kingdoms.
No one provokes me with impunity.
Meanwhile, Mary disastrously involved herself in factional politics at home rather than staying above the internal disputes of her nobles and thus being queen and ruler of all Scotland. She married for a second time against the advice of her advisers, Lord Darnley. Within a year, the marriage was a shell as Mary ensured that Darnley was kept distanced from any form of power. Her son James was born in Stirling Castle and baptised Catholic, increasing the fears of all Protestants in Scotland.
There is no marvel in a woman learning to speak, but there would be in teaching her to hold her tongue.
However, it was her third marriage in 1567 to the detested Lord Bothwell that finally caused a constitutional crisis and gave Queen Elizabeth opportunity to question Mary's choices.
How could a worse choice be made for your honour than in such haste to marry such a subject, who besides other notorious lacks, public fame hath charged with the murder of your late husband, beside the touching of yourself also in some part, though we trust that in that behalf falsely.
Finally, Scotland had had enough, and following an uprising, Mary was imprisoned in Lochleven Castle, where she gave birth to 2 stillborn twins, and was forced to abdicate in favour of her year-old son, James.
No more tears now. I will think about revenge.
Mary, helped by supporters, escaped Lochleven Castle, but was then defeated at Langside by the Protestant faction in Scotland. Mary fled to England, seeking succour from the only other woman monarch in Christendom.
It is a natural virtue, incident to our sex, to be pitiful of those that are afflicted.
Instead, Mary found herself incarcerated for the following 19 years and used as a political pawn for Elizabeth's requirements. Mary was a continual thorn in Elizabeth's reign, but Elizabeth was unwilling to dispose of Mary as she would any other dangerous opponent. Mary was, after all, like Elizabeth, another of God's anointed monarchs. Even though Mary was no longer a queen by Scotland's constitution, she was still, in Elizabeth's mind and religion, above man's law, and was therefore still an anointed queen. To put such a person to death was to damn her own soul. That position stayed the same until, in November 1583, a Francis Throckmorton was arrested and tortured. He admitted that there was a plot against Elizabeth and that Mary was implicated in it. This changed everything. Mary was, even 15 years out of the public eye, still a political rallying call against Elizabeth's reign. But Elizabeth did not take swift action. For 4 years she swithered and hesitated to act. Eventually, Mary was deemed guilty of treason for plotting against Elizabeth, and despite the political fallout that would inevitably come from her decision, Elizabeth executed Mary in Fotheringay Castle in 1587. It took the executioner 3 attempts to sever the head from the body.
Look to your consciences. And remember that the theatre of the world is wider than the realm of England.
The final irony is that, while it could legitimately be argued that Elizabeth took to absolute rule with more finesse and political nous than her rival Mary, it was the Scottish branch of the family that finally took claim to the English crown, and it was Mary's son James that claimed it. Yet even as his personal fortune rose in that fortuitous event, Scotland lost a monarch living in Scotland at a time when a strong king invested strength and identity in the Scottish nation as a whole.
Men fight wars. Women win them.
But that isn't why I'm so fascinated by these two women who took no formal steps to make women's lives more open and autonomous during their lifetimes. But to a great degree, neither of these women were completely autonomous themselves. Mary died because of her known ambition for power and a seat on the English throne. But it was accusation by men that sealed her fate. The English crown was a far richer, more glittering throne than its Scottish counterpart. It was more reminiscent of the French court in which she grew up, and it was therefore a prize worth fighting for. Elizabeth, however, emphasised by word her weakness as a woman, but she ensured that she was viewed as being as politically aware as any king, and that, when necessity demanded it, she acted as ruthlessly as any of her male relatives. At least, that's what we have been told in those stories and plays. But Mary, like Elizabeth, her figure's distorted by time and place. And we are not the people of the 16th century. But we can say that no one is an island, and events require many parts to make them appear coherent. Mary was also a prisoner, and a focal point for English dissent. She was named as a conspirator by a man who had been placed under extreme torture, but she never admitted to the charge. But Elizabeth was also constrained by cultural realities, and autonomy was not always within her grasp. Mary was too dangerous for Elizabeth to allow to live indefinitely. Too many factions, both internal and external, would use her again. What we do know is that Mary died by beheading for political means. These two women lived in the Renaissance, a time that was on the cusp between the old ways of life and the new. The word Renaissance means rebirth, and many social norms and government institutions we recognise today began while other things fell away. Mary and Elizabeth literally helped to reshape how we think of ourselves. It may have been an unintended consequence of what was thought to be bigger things, but that they ruled as women and were taken seriously sent a message to women. And those women may not even have recognised that the message had been received. Nevertheless, women began to appear in the public realm as poets and playwrights, for example, often quietly and anonymously, but with growing confidence. Kings and queens are no longer God's anointed ruler on earth, and the legacy of the anonymous and the often quiet women, with increasing numbers of women writers, poets, actors, doctors, scientists, inventors, entrepreneurs, and social engineers. Women are still finding their voice, and that's why Mary and Elizabeth are important figures in women's histories.
As for my own part, I care not for death, for all men are mortal. And though I be a woman, yet I have as good a courage answerable to my place as ever my father had. I am your anointed queen. I will never be by violence constrained to do anything. I thank God I am indeed endowed with such qualities that if I were turned out of the realm in my petticoat, I were able to live in any place in Christendom.
In episode 2, we'll pick up our story about 1850, when women campaigned against poor housing conditions, limited health services, and no representation in Parliament. And we'll pause in 1928, when women over 21 got the right to vote in public elections. We'd like to thank everyone who helped us put together episode 1. That includes Leslie Mitchell for reading Elizabeth, Nora McCarrow for reading Mary, Michael Makocha for reading John Knox, Steve Ogden, Sunny G Radio, Lisa Donati at Giat Laldi, Brian E. Cullen, and Kirsty Mooney. Thank you very much. Want to find out more or listen to this show again? Head on over to sunnyg.com/Aye Lassie to play this and other episodes as many times as you like. You can also check out extra materials related to each show. Feel free to get in touch via our Twitter account, that's @Aye Lassie Radio, and let us know what you think.